Well, I'd just like to start by saying a few words about WI's interest in this area and some of our ambitions for the wider programme of work on food security during the whole of this year. The concept of pressure on the food system is not a new one, of course, for the WI, as we've already heard from Antoinette. Many of the members here tonight will be only too well aware that the supply of food to the war-torn nation was the centre of every WI's activities in 1915. And by the Second World War, the then Ministry of Food was allocating sugar to WI preservation centres in order to make jam and produce what would otherwise go to waste. Now, the jam label has obviously stuck, but not without good reason. Because between 1940 and 1945, WI members preserved nearly £12 million of fruit for the nation. So it's no wonder we're associated with jam, and we're jolly well proud of it as well. But of course, today, the challenges that face the food system are clearly on a very different scale. Demand for food is growing. As fast developing countries grow wealthier and their populations continue to expand, demand for food also increases. And by 2050, as we've already heard, it is expected that the current population will grow to 9 billion, currently at 7 billion. I don't think we even have to look as far as 2050. The challenges, even for the next 20 years, are going to be considerable. Individual consumption is also on the rise, and consequently, the demand for food is increasing at a much faster rate than the population. Combined with more frequent extreme weather, such as drought and floods, there are already signs that food shortages are becoming a very real issue. The impact, as we have seen, can be severe, and the recent civil unrest even in the Middle East has been linked to increases in food prices. And rainforests are being cleared at a spectacular rate to make way for crops, leading to further climate chaos. And on the domestic front, the number of people turning to food banks for assistance, British consumers are finding it increasingly difficult to sustain a healthy diet as the price of fresh produce continues to rise. Yet what hasn't changed is the need for public dialogue and engagement with these issues. And this is where I believe that the WI movement can play a really important role, ensuring people have a safe, sustainable and nutritious supply of food is likely to be one of the most significant public policy challenges of this century. Any conversation about food security must recognise the breadth of the issue, from climate change to population growth, from food waste to the efficiency of our supply chains. We also have to look at food technologies, such as the development of GM to hunger internationally and in a Western context, the public health challenges presented by the nation's expanding waistlines. These are complex challenges, there is no doubt about that. Challenges for scientists, industry producers, academics, policymakers and politicians alike. And while the scale of the challenge clearly means that some of the solutions may well seem daunting, and I know when we first set out on this, I really think this is one heck of a challenge, but when you break it down, it's not so much so. So obviously there is a challenge, but there are also a wide range of opportunities for us to work on the subject. Individuals and households can all play their part, and each year, as we heard, UK households throw away 8.3 million tonnes of food, and nearly 60% of food is wasted even before it reaches the supermarket shelves. Now, to me, that's criminal. It isn't, that is criminal. Yet, despite the recognition that increased public discussion must play a role in finding solutions, we're all good at talking about it, but we have to find those solutions, and we have to tackle the challenges of food security. But to date, there has been little public conversation about these issues. In fact, research from the Global Food Security Programme, which was published last year, suggested that while 1 in 10 had never heard of the term global food security, and over half believed it's more a problem for people in developing countries. And we hope that our programme of work on food security will go some way in tackling this myth by helping to build public understanding of the scale of the challenge facing the global food system. Now, the WI's campaign on food security was launched on the 6th of December at York, along with our discussion paper, Food for Thought, Global and National Challenge on Food Security. The report sets out key debates and evidence about food security for a consumer audience through examining what is driving rising food prices and how and why the security and sustainability of our food supply is potentially at risk. It also examines a range of factors covering the whole food production chain from field to plate. And we hope that tonight's event will encourage strong debate on the role that we can play as individuals and set out some of the tough challenges ahead and consider both the consequences of our buying decisions that we take as consumers and the failure of not taking any action. We will be rallying the WI's 211,000+ members across England and Wales throughout this year to get to the crux of the question facing the global food system by encouraging them to hold great food debates in their own local communities. We'll be asking our members to do what they do best, which is to reach out into their communities and bring what can be marginalised issues to the forefront of national concern, changing the terms of debate and spreading the word about what we can do differently to meet the challenges facing our food system. I hope you do enjoy the evening, and I hope you will pose difficult questions for our eminent panellists this evening.
I'll start by thanking Antoinette for hosting us this evening. It's good to be able to have this sort of discussion here in the Assembly, and I'm glad to see that Alid and Russell have been able to join us as well, and also escaped the tyranny of the chamber in order to, in your case, stand next to a food. But pleased to see that we're able to have this debate here as well. And I'll start off by agreeing very much with what Antoinette said in her introduction. And it's not often said, is it, Antoinette? I'm glad it's been filmed. The conversation that we're having today is in many ways one of the defining issues of our times, because we have for many years, when I was a student, and it was 30 years ago now since I started in Aberystwyth, one of the subjects that we discussed then was resource shortage and the predictions of war based not on boundaries but on access to resources. And since then, I worked in the Middle East. I worked in the occupied territories in the Jordan Valley, and one of the great tensions there was, of course, access not only to have from the Palestinian population of having access to land, but also having access to the water to be able to grow on that land. And one of the conversations I think we started having, as I say, it's going back 30 years now, we're actually beginning to see now the reality of that theory and those conversations. And I think it's one of the great challenges facing politicians across the whole of the political spectrum, and also across different political environments, whether we're here in Cardiff or in London or in Brussels. And, you know, we started off by talking about the scale of a challenge facing us, potential of 9 billion people living on the planet in a few decades' time. But I think we need to be very, very clear that there are already 870 million people living with malnourishment as a part of their daily lives. That is a reality today. We can talk about it, and sometimes when we talk about the future, we almost move the challenge away from ourselves here today. We almost say it's for somebody else, for another generation, it's in the future. But that is an emergency facing us today here as we speak and discuss these things. And those 170 million people aren't living somewhere else, many miles from here. They're living in this country. There are some of those people living in Wales today, living in my constituency in Blaenau Gwent. 2,000 people in Blaenau Gwent were fed over Christmas by a food bank. With 2,000 people in that constituency were reliant on food from a food bank over Christmas. And when I was talking to people working in the food bank in Vale in the week before Christmas, they were preparing not simply to replenish their stocks in the new year, but to look at trebling their workload in the new year, expanding the food bank. And this is where we are today. We're talking not simply about an emergency that will face the world in some decades' time. We're talking about almost the reintroduction of soup kitchens here in our societies and the people I represent in Blaenau Gwent. So it isn't an emergency facing someone else somewhere else. It isn't an emergency of another time, of another age. It's something which is happening in our country today. Children will go to bed hungry tonight, they will wake up hungry in the morning, and they will be suffering for not only from a day-to-day basis, but their lives will be blighted by malnutrition here in Wales today. And that is an emergency we simply cannot ignore. And it is an absolute tragedy that that is happening, and that some of the weakest and most vulnerable people in our society are facing those sorts of traumas in Wales today. But it's a tragedy that can be avoided, and I believe a tragedy that any government has a responsibility to face and to overcome. Wales is a country that does, of course, produce food. We're well known for our food. Whenever we have people here, international visitors, we give them the Welsh lamb, we say this is what we produce here, and cockles as a starter and the rest of it. And we're well known as food producers, and we produce high quality food here in Wales. I think many of us were brought up to value the food that we produce here in Wales, and I think it remains deep in the Welsh psyche, and an abiding attachment to food production. You know, when we were dealing with the crisis in the dairy sector last summer, a number of my constituents in urban Wales, in Abertillery, Bramar, in Tredigga, in Vale, made it very, very clear to me that they weren't interested in simply paying the cheapest possible price for a pint of milk. What they wanted to do was to pay a fair price for a pint of milk. That attachment to production, that recognition that you can't have a fair and equal society or equitable society without fairness hardwired through the means of production is something that I believe is deep within our psyche. And we have to, I believe, ensure that there will be a greater focus on food in the second part of this assembly. I made a speech, which obviously nobody remembers, last year in the Royal Welsh Show, and I said, what I don't want for the next year or so is for us to be imprisoned, our minds to be imprisoned in the straitjacket of CAP. And what we forget about, we talk about reforms, we talk about the regulations, all the technicalities, but we forget about the purpose, which is the production of food. We all left the Royal Welsh Show, and we all became imprisoned by CAP, and we all talked about regulations, we all talked about the technical side of things, not just you, Mary, but me as well. And we all forgot about the purpose of it. But I hope that we will be able to return to a greater focus on food in the second. I mean, food and education, food as part of the environment, and also the research which surrounds food, and food as a critical part of our economy. And the challenges facing us in in developing and facing up to the challenge of food security are well known, and Marylyn has already spoken about zero waste and the rest of it. I want to touch on some of those subjects tonight. What I want to do is to say three things about what contribution this small nation can make to this what I believe is an international, global and local and national emergency. I think it's the first thing that we can do as a country here in Wales is to contribute to a consensus and a demand through our international engagement that hunger and malnutrition is unacceptable, and that both states and international organisations must address these issues of food supply and future food security, and must do that immediately. I attended a Council of Ministers meeting last year in Brussels, where we were talking about, it sounds better in French, I'm told, a Spare Food for Poor People programme. I hope it sounds better in French anyway. Somebody here can have translate it for us. But it is about food which is available in Europe being transferred, and ensuring that people who are unable to purchase food themselves, or where there are shortages, and that food is supplied to them. The UK government's opted out of it, and I regret that very deeply, and I've spoken to the United Kingdom government about that, and I said that we should be a part of that sort of initiative, not simply in order to ensure that we contribute what we can, but because we have, I believe, a moral imperative to be a part of any organisation, both within the European Union and elsewhere, where we ensure that food is used, and that our ability to actually transfer food to where people require it is something that we can do. But as a government, we sit on and attend many international meetings, many international boards, and I believe that we have a responsibility as a government to make use of that presence, make use of that voice, to argue for the measures that national governments, international organisations can take to ensure that food security is an issue that remains on the top agenda of an international agenda, and one to which we are able to address. So we can contribute to a wider consensus internationally. A second point I'd make here is that we can contribute, I believe, to a greater efficiency in agriculture and food production. And I make no apology at all for saying that we have to drive forward efficiency in how we produce food. We have these conversations, I had with Nick and Mary in the last 2 or 3 days. Food, notwithstanding what I just said about milk, food is already too expensive for too many people in my constituency. When people talk to me, I say, we know you're a farms minister and the rest of it, but you know, when you talk about Welsh lamb, I'd like to be able to buy it as well. And for too many people, our food that we produce in Wales is already too expensive. And that's a reality for too many people already here. I don't believe that the answer to that question is necessarily greater and more and different subsidies. That simply clouds the issue for today. It enables non-viable businesses to survive from today till tomorrow. It doesn't answer the fundamental questions of efficiency, and it doesn't either enable us to build a strong agricultural industry. You can't have a strong industry if it consists of too many weak individual businesses. It doesn't work like that. So we have to, I make no apology for it at all, ensure that we continue to drive forward efficiency in how we produce we produce food. And I believe in Wales we already do have a very good story to tell about this. I believe that we do, through our Farming Connect work, are able to work with individual farming businesses to drive forward efficiency. We've just invested in your term in greater funding to enable us to do that in dairy in a way that we weren't able to do so in the past. What I want to do in 2013 is to extend some of the principles that we've used in dairy through to lamb and sheep production as well. I believe that we can do that. We've also got some great innovators in our universities and elsewhere. We've got the work that's been done in Cardiff has contributed already to our food strategies in Wales. I think that work is great, Terry, and we want to see more of that. We've also got IBAs in Aberystwyth, of course, it's good to see her in arriving here. And what I hope we'll be able to do is to ensure that we can continue to drive forward innovation in how we produce food, because we have to do that if we are to derive the greatest potential from our opportunities. And that investment in science and research is something which I hope will survive the current debate and discussions taking place around the European budget. And the final point I'll make on this is that as a country, we, I believe, need to make food not only a part of our daily lives as a part of a physical necessity, but also recognise that there's a knowledge and appreciation of food which is hardwired into how we live together. All too often, when I speak to people, even like a superintendent, there is different reliance on processed packaged foods and that. But at the same time, there is a lack of knowledge, a real lack of knowledge about the food chain and how food is packaged. It is absolutely essential in our daily with children in school understand where food comes from and understand the basics of food production. And I hope that by hardwiring an intervention, if you like, or ensuring that people understand the chain of production, that we will be able to generate greater I'll finish in conclusion. I hosted a food summit last summer with His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, making the keynote speech at that time. We are very clear. I made a written statement following that in the autumn, and I hope to make an oral statement. Assembly members here will understand what I'm saying here, because I'm making a commitment which I'll be held to. I can see you smile already after me. I'll be making an oral statement before the Easter recess on how we will be taking forward food policy in this place. We have opportunities here to be an international and world leader. We are already in some of the things that we do. We are already sometimes in some of our thinking, in some of the policies we drive forward. I want Wales to be able to demonstrate that a small country, a small nation of 3 million people, understands the global crisis that we are and will be facing. And I hope that we can demonstrate as well that this small country can do things together as a community, but can also contribute and make a real contribution to the debates and the discussions that happen across the European Union and internationally. And by doing that, I hope that we will be able to make our contribution here in Wales to addressing and facing up to the crisis of the 870 million people who tonight will go to bed hungry. Diolch yn fawr iawn.